Thank you, Stacy, and thank you for the center for sending me this invitation. It's really wonderful to be able to share work and talk to a group of wonderful women out here doing amazing things. And thank you all for being here today. I know the weather at first seemed like it was going to be kind of a damper, but it seems like the sun is on our side and bringing us some nice sunshine. So I'm really glad to be here with you. First off, I wanted to. So that's good working? Okay, great. So I wanted to share a little origin story of my own. You'll see the woman with the dark black hair is my mother, Shirley Scarborough, and that's my father. I tried to pick a photograph when they were young so you would kind of get the point. But both my parents attended ETSU. And they absolutely loved it. Ever since I was a kid, I heard stories about what a wonderful place it was. My mom had gone to the other school that's known for its orange, and she didn't quite think it was the right fit. So her and her best friend came here, and her best friend Joyce had really blonde hair, and she had dark hair. So around campus, they were known as Salt and Pepper. I've heard this all my life. And then my father, she studied art history, then became an art teacher over in the Greenville Public Schools. And my father studied history, and he would talk on and on about the wonderful history professor here. And he was a part of a fraternity, and he would tell me these wonderful stories of the heyday of fraternities where the fraternity bought a hearse, and they had a sign that they would put on it, and it would say, "We want your body." Probably not appropriate these days, but they had a lot of fun, and he was very excited about it. And so I can easily say that without my parents going to school at ETSU, I wouldn't be here. They actually met on the steps of the old library. So I wanted to kind of share that a little bit. So one of the ways that I got and became a storyteller was my father. My father, he worked in big box management. So think of like Woolco, if you've heard of those, the old Kmart's, what would become Walmart, where he worked eventually. But if you knew my dad, he was always a storyteller at heart. And when I was growing up with my brother, every time my dad was off, it was always getting near his knee somewhere, someplace on vacation, and he was telling us these amazing stories. And we were always on the edge of every word, even until he eventually got dementia and was no longer to share his stories. And so it's a real moment of legacy to be here with you all in the place that I think he sort of found his voice. And so all my life, I've kind of wondered about storytelling, right? It's such a powerful medium. We see big Hollywood movies, we see documentaries, we tell stories on all of these different, disciplines that we have. And I've always kind of wondered, where's the power behind it, right? You know what it's like, right? When you're hanging out with your friends and you're having a good time and somebody tells you one of those nice long yarns, right? And you're just kind of enjoying it. And there's sort of that moment, I feel like, at least, when something kind of reaches in the back of my head and it's like that moment, or my heart, and I kind of feel like I'm completely engaged in the story and I've got to know what happens next, or I feel really connected emotionally to them. And for a long time, I knew there had to be something there, but it was kind of this magic, but I didn't know where to find it. As my intro shared with you, I've spent 30 years in journalism. I've worked in the Newport Plain Talk, it's about an hour and a half away, doing small rural newsroom journalism. And then I went on to the Arizona Republic, covered public safety for a long time. Then I ended up going to Us Weekly magazine, covering celebrities. And then I went into cable news at E! News, where I wrote for both the online publication, but also helped produce the show. So it was kind of a wide variety of story mediums. And so I think I've always just sort of been obsessed with sort of storytelling in all of its ways and trying to figure out, where is that? Where's that special sauce that makes it so amazing? So, one of the reasons, right, is why stories, right? So they educate, they connect us, they create community, right? They motivate us. They're informative, right? They're entertaining, they are emotive, right? We feel things. I tell all my students, I don't care about all the details in your story. I don't care about your photojournalism unless you feel it here. And if there's one thing you learned from me, I just want you to know that story is about what you feel and how you make other people feel, right? So it's not the thoughts that are created. It's not the facts, although they're the most important things, right? We have to have good, accurate information. But really, when it comes down to telling a story and to interpreting those facts, the statistics, the research that we do, it's all about how you connect with other people. So I like this quote a lot. Most people are not data-driven, right? They're driven by emotional stories. Only then can we prove the data, give them context, give them evidence, but they need to be moved by the story first. And this is a public health professor. And I just thought, like, when you think about that in terms, we live in a world of data now. There's constant data. People are taking our data. We're giving our data. So much of the information we have is about that. But if you think in terms of whatever the work we do, like, how do we translate it in a way that people can relate to it in a really simple way? Often when I do interviews with people, I will say, hey, tell it to me like I'm a sixth grader, right? I want to be able to break it down really simply so I can get it across. So on that search to basically find that sort of magic sauce, if you will, I went to get my MFA when I was at E-News. I decided I'd always wanted to be a screenwriter. When I was a little kid, I actually wrote a screenplay for Benji. Does anybody know the movie Benji at all? Okay, so I loved it. And I actually, when I was like in middle school with my best friend, wrote some script and we sent it off to like Paramount or someplace. And we swore, and I still kind of think they might owe me residuals for one of those, like, second or third movies they did on Benji. But it was just always something I wanted to do. And so when I got to that point in my life, I thought, I want to go back to school. And so I decided to go get my MFA. Well, while I was there, I met a wonderful person named Tracy Granick. She also was sort of a journalist by trade, although she worked in the medical field. So she did a lot of medical narratives, healthcare narratives, did a lot of documentary work. And she worked at a place called MedStar Health. MedStar Health is like a 10 hospital system between Baltimore, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. And when we became friends in grad school, we kind of realized we had a lot in common. And so she was also a screenwriting major. So we talked about this center that she created at MedStar Health. And it's the Center for Healthcare Narratives. And I'm on the advisory board. And so as part of that, she tells different stories. Like she goes out in the community of the hospitals and talks to patients, does sort of narrative medicine, if you will. Does anyone know kind of a little bit about narrative medicine, what it is? Okay. So basically people are telling the stories like as patients so we can help educate. They can also have healing from that. It's important for doctors and nurses who work in, obviously, like during COVID, these really traumatic times. So it gives them an opportunity to share their stories. And for her, it's an important way to like reduce medical errors. They found that people didn't want to share like processes, things that happened, but if they started to get them to tell their stories, then they were more likely to like find the root cause of what happened and be able to save lives, right? So she asked me to help pen a case study on a project she did. So she did using short narrative film built on the dramatic arc to drive meaningful change in healthcare. And the issue is about sepsis. Does anyone know a little bit about sepsis at all? So sepsis is a infection that happens. Like it's when it becomes like the immune system breaks down and you're not able to actually combat the infection. And about 1.7 million adults each year get it in hospitals and different healthcare locations. And about 350,000, and this is per the CDC, die every year. So they had noticed at MedStar that this was a really big problem and they were having a lot of patients die from this and they wanted to do something about it. So she created this documentary and they found someone who'd actually survived it to tell their story. Quite extraordinary couple and their journey, what they went through, right? So I had mentioned that, I've sort of been on this search to figure out sort of what that thing is with stories, right? And before that, I had this idea, and I don't know where it kind of came from, but I thought of stories sort of like photosynthesis, and that somehow stories were like the sun, and how the plants like take it in, and then they create fuel to like bring life. To me, stories sort of did the same thing. Like stories sort of has this energy and ability to transform things. There's a transformational thing that happens. It brings people to action, right? It gets them to do things. It gets them to think differently. But it wasn't until I got to work on this study with my friend Tracy that I really understood that there was actually something really behind it. So in this case, basically the film's purpose was to increase sepsis awareness, right, in emergency departments as part of this hospital-wide initiative. And then ultimately, the film, they took the people that worked at the hospital and they saw that it was so successful across the hospital system and raising awareness that they realized, hey, we need to do something like outside the system. So hospitals sometimes have like a liaison with the legislature and different things like that, right? And so they actually got their person to then start working using this film to go talk to the Maryland state legislature. And they were able to get them to pass legislation to create a state awareness campaign. And so part of the case study was us trying to tell the story of like why why, like the process we did, how they had done, like found the person, used the person, got them to tell their story, open up, use documentary film to do that, and then how you can really create a lot of action, get advocacy, and really change things, right, in and out of the hospitals. So as part of preparing for the case study paper, my friend Tracy introduced me to Paul Zak. Paul Zak is a neuroscientist, and he was the guy that solved my issue. He's the one that answered my question of like why stories actually have this power. So he's a professor of economic sciences at Claremont Graduate University, and he's sort of known as the founder of the neuroscience of narratives. And so this is actually his words. So I thought I would just read you his own sort of origin story as how this came about. I thought it was kind of interesting. So during a night flight home to California after 5 days in Washington, D.C., I discovered that I'm the last person you would want sitting next to you on a plane. Tired and unable to bang on my laptop in the turbulence at 40,000 feet, I decided to watch $1 Million Baby. Anybody seen $1 Million Baby? Right? Great movie. I hadn't seen it, and I figured Clint Eastwood directed film that had won the Oscar for Best Picture would be a deserved break for a hard week. It's a wonderful film, and I became deeply absorbed in it. The narrative is circumscribed by a father-daughter story and concludes with an agonizing act. When the movie was over, the man next to me said, "Sir, is there something I can do to help you?" I was crying. Well, not really crying, more like heaving big sloppy sobs out of my eyes, nose, and mouth. Everyone around could hear me, but I could not suppress my sadness. So obviously the film had a big impact, right? And it's a fiction film, right? So that became his search for the science of narrative. So after I recovered, I began to wonder what had happened to me. I was cognitively intact, aware of my surroundings and who I was. And yet the story was so engaging that it caused my brain to react as if I were a character in the movie, as if one of my own daughters were the one suffering. I experienced heartache as the movie ended, but then it was only a story. As a neuroscientist, I knew that movies changed our brain activity in some way, but how? So it's that same thing, right? I knew there was something, right? As soon as I realized I had stumbled upon a potentially useful way to extend my studies of the social brain. So this is the guy who answered my question. So the experience I had watching $1 Million Baby caused me to wonder if movies, in addition to direct personal interactions, would cause oxytocin release. To test this, my colleague Jorge Barraza edited a set of short video clips that we obtained with permission from St. Jude's Research Hospital. One version shows a father talking to the camera while his 2-year-old son, Ben, who has terminal brain cancer, plays in the background. And this is what his research found. So I was very happy to hear there was science with storytelling. We always hear in the arts, it's like, oh, it's art. But I was like, oh no, actually we have science behind our art. Thank you very much, which I thought was pretty cool. So to me, it's like an opportunity to start to think in terms of like, how can we use the dramatic arc, right? A dramatic story to help us with our goal, whatever our purpose is, right? When we're trying to get something across. So just like the documentary that my friend Tracy did, you can see that was part of that case study, is that we use the dramatic arc to tell that story. So people have empathy and are, engaged and want to do something. And so that engagement then was not only did it go around the hospital and help create sepsis awareness, but we went outside and we got the legislators involved, right? And then they were encouraged and moved to do some action. And then that, of course, then continued to ripple. So you can see how the power of one story can change the legislature. It can change the way people think around the state and even around the country, right? If we continue to tell those types of stories. And so one of the things it does, right, is it creates the empathy. Dramatic stories increase the cortisol, thereby increasing your attention, right? So we grab your attention, that hook, right, that all stories have. And then it helps change behavior, which I think is one of the big powerful things about it and why it can help like you as students or you as faculty members, because we all have research, we all have projects we're doing. And so if we can get people to like accept our proposal, give us grant money, right? There's lots of ways that if we bring storytelling in to the work that we're doing, we have a better chance of actually getting a positive outcome, which is what I think is great about it. So again, they also help us with cause and effect relationships. They help us see patterns in important information, pay attention, and empathize with people. So I'm also very interested in origin stories. And the reason that I wanted to talk a little bit about origin stories is, we see them like they're the things of the myths and of the legends and of big Hollywood movies. My personal favorite is Batman Begins. Like growing up as a kid, I always loved Batman. And when I finally saw the movie that told me the secret of how he got all the cool moves and was able to do all the interesting things, and he went to the secret society, like I just was completely enthralled, right? But there's a lot of like ones that are so good, right? Like we can probably sit here on our fingers and count off all the really bad Hollywood movies, all the like cliched origin stories that we hear. But I'm not here to talk about big origin stories. We all have them. So like every one of us, right, all have an origin. Like it's just like story. We're all storytellers. Everybody uses language and communication in their lives, whether they're storytellers or not, right? So it's just another way that we're human, right? It's part of being human. And so I think that when you think in terms of origin, you want to think in terms of like the different parts of your life. So I have a student that is in my magazine class right now, and she's trying to tell a very complicated story about her mother, who was a journalist in Chile during a time where there wasn't free press, and how she kind of went through the political struggles there and then eventually decided to immigrate to the United States. And now she's a teacher in Sevierville. And it's a very long story. She had to learn English. She had 2 children she brought with her. One of them is my student. And so it's a big story. And so sometimes when we get too big of a story, it's kind of hard, right, to make it relatable, because we start to like do generalization. And the way that we really connect with people is through specifics, through sensory things, right? Like the best stories are the ones that tell us how it smelled or how it looked or put us in the sense of place, right? We get a sense of personality, right? So I like to think of origin stories as little bite-sized things. Personally, I think that we all have different phases in our lives. When I look back at my career, for instance, I started out as a small-time reporter in a rural area, right? And then I ended up going across the country. And then I had a whole adventure at the Arizona Republic. Then I left and I moved to California. And then I went into entertainment reporting, which I never thought in the world I'd ever do. Then I went into television. I never thought I'd work for cable television. Those were the broadcast people. I had nothing to want to do with them, right? I was a serious print journalist, right? But like my life changed. But in all of that, even in that big scope of me easily breaking it up like that, there's a million little origin stories of what happened and how I redefined myself, how my narrative changed, how I sold myself to other people, right? And there's no one real answer. But if we look at ourselves like that and start to tell those stories, it's powerful, right? It gives a way for people to relate to us. So this is James Weldon Johnson, and I kind of like this quote, "Yours is the quest that's just begun." And I think that's kind of a quote that can kind of be at any time of your life, right? And so I currently, for the last 5 years, have worked with Emory University's James Weldon Johnson Institute for the study of race and difference. I was actually... So I'm new to academia. I've been a reporter up until about 6 years ago. And then I had a freelance business that I still do. And during that freelance business, I started working with them. So as part of their project that they do every year, I help write the annual report. The Institute was started in 2007, and it fosters new scholarship and public engagement that examines race and the intersection of dimensions of human difference, including class, gender, religion, and sexuality. In many ways, they're a lot like the Center. And they actually have a colloquium series just like this that they do as part of this. And so I have been writing the profiles of the different fellows for like the last 5 years. Has anybody heard of JWJI at all? There's a really great, if you're like a student or a scholar, like they have amazing programs. And I'll get to that here. So since 2019 until now, and I'm getting ready to start interviewing my next class of fellows, I've conducted 52 interviews and written profiles for the annual fellows. It includes Emory graduates, like honors, like undergraduates that are doing their thesis, right? Their undergraduate thesis. It includes United Negro College Fund Mellon scholars, graduate dissertation fellows, the James T. Laney dissertation fellows, JWJI visiting, which are usually like they're they're like further on in their career. And then we have a Mellon postdoctoral fellows that come. So you can see it's everything from like starting your academic career to being, you could have like published 10 books and still going for a new one. And you want to have a year that you can spend at Emory. They have a beautiful building where everyone has their own office. They get paid, right, to take the time off away from teaching so they can focus on whatever their project is. And their projects are everything from, like I said, like a thesis to a dissertation. Sometimes it's taking the dissertation and turning it into a monograph or a book. So there's all kinds of interesting scholarship that they do. And so as part of that, I started to kind of listen to the interviews that I was doing. And every time I started doing it, like there's always the scholars who know, they're great at interviews, right? They know how to tell their story. They know how to tell their project. And then I would have even people like further along, right? That not necessarily the undergraduates that just didn't seem like they knew how to talk about their subject. And then I would get some scholars who were new and they were maybe working on their dissertation. And it was the first time they'd ever actually talked to somebody outside of like their mentors or whatever about it. And so I noticed that they would start to they were feeling their way through their content. And as I started them, I realized, the story in itself is pretty simple, right? It's basically who you are, where you teach now, or where you're in grad school, kind of what your project is, why you're here, right? And then what did you get out of the JWJI experience? They do professional development. They have the colloquium. They give you money to go to archives. They do a tour of all the different HBCUs and other libraries in the Atlanta area. They provide money for if you are you have your dissertation or a paper or a book and you need to get experts to come in. I forget what that's called because I'm new, guys, but when they have a review to give you some feedback as you're doing it. So they give you money for that. So there's a lot of things that they do to help kind of, mold you and develop you as an emerging scholar. And so I realized as I was doing them that they were starting to get longer and longer. And, I kind of knew what I was going to, get to, but I started to realize that oftentimes I wasn't really getting to the heart of anything. Yeah, I knew that it was your book and it was about this time and this person and this figure and you found these archives, but I was like, I'm not resonating with it. And I want to feel something. As an interviewer, as a journalist, I want to know, right? I want to connect. That's what I love about story. That's my thing, right? That's my addiction. And so I wanted to find a way to get into that. And so what that ended up being is, of course, I would always do a little research before I had my interviews, as any good journalist would, or researcher, right? And then I listened and I realized how important it was for me to really be present in the moment. And then also be curious and be patient at the same time. So I would wait and keep asking questions and just keep being my own kind of curiosity. So if I'm interested in it, I assume other people will be interested in it. So I just kept going until I would finally get to a place where I had sort of what I would consider that aha moment, or I get the reporter gut, which is oh, this is it. This is why they're doing it. This is the spark. This makes sense of all the other stuff, right? Because a lot of times you can have the project or you can have all the things that people do, but it doesn't come alive, right? Until you have some way to connect with them. And so that's what I found is that it's the origin stories. It's these little origin stories that really started to kind of coalesce and become the things that really fueled all of the stories. And I started to see more and more how effective it was and how people that were doing kind of scholarship it was coming from lots of different places. It wasn't necessarily the mentor or the class they took at undergraduate, but it was a lot of time personal things, very personal things. People that were still trying to figure out, one of the recent ones I did was about a woman who was born in Puerto Rico and she is African American and she lives now here, but she's trying to through philosophy, figure out what it means to be a person born in a post-colonial place, and then also, and what colonialism means to her and the different experiences as a Black woman here in America, and kind of breaking that down for herself. And so it's the way she's navigating it. And so I needed to get deeper and deeper to kind of figure out what's really driving her? Why is there a moment? Is there something that ties this together in some way that I can show? And so I started to think that origin stories, we kind of not really giving them the credit that they deserve, and that it's a tool that we can use. So here's an example of one that I did early on. I'll just kind of read the beginning. So this is a dissertation fellow. Her name's Yami Rodriguez from Yale University. As a third grader in Metro Atlanta, Ileana Yami Rodriguez remembers not having anyone to write about for Hispanic Heritage Month. She grew up not seeing herself represented in history, in books, or popular culture. In her freshman year at the University of Georgia, the University System of Georgia banned entrance to undocumented immigrant students. Rodriguez, a first-generation Mexican-American, had family and friends of mixed legal status. Some were unable to attend the state's top 5 universities and feared being reported to immigration authorities. That inspired Rodriguez to get involved with the university and community activist as part of the undocumented student movement. She applied for and got accepted to a graduate program at Yale University, where she helps mentor and where mentors helped her understand that she could incorporate community activism with an academic career. Rodriguez initially thought she would study undocumented student movement tactics, but realized that the movement actually began with what she calls the early arrivals of Mexican and Latinx pioneers in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And she goes on to talk about how in communities in Atlanta, there were all of these communities kind of coming into being in the 60s and 70s, and they had like community newspapers, and so she's gone through the archives. And so it was just sort of the entrance into understanding the work, and the actual work itself is different, right? It's about those community newspapers and things, but it's like, how did she enter that? Why is it meaningful for her? Why does she care about it? That makes me want to care about her work. The other one is Courtney Baker from University of California, Riverside. So she's one of my fellow alums, so I love her. So Courtney Baker thinks she discovered the power of cinema as a young girl watching the 1970 Disney movie Escape to Witch Mountain. Has anybody seen Escape to Witch Mountain? All right. I love that movie. She remembers running out of the theater as a young child and her dad finding her in the lobby overwhelmed and afraid. That has stuck with me a long time because I'm interested in film and have a really visceral reaction to film. Maybe that is where my interest came from, Baker says. I think every scholar is feeding some unconscious desire. And on some level, I'm trying to deal with my extreme responses that are prompted by films. It's one of the questions to pose rhetorically for anyone interested in Black studies and Black visual studies. Whose interests are being served by the images we see? And so, of course, it goes on. So to me, when I finally got to her after a long time of I just said, hey, what's your favorite film? And what influenced you? And she got to that moment, it was like, right? Then we got to the heart of really why she's studying what she is. And so I think, again, it's important for us to do that, right? To take time. And I think for whether you're a student, whether you're a scholar, I encourage you to go back and think about your own life, think about your own work. And so I was hoping that maybe you could kind of come along with me and do a little exercise. You don't have to really do anything, but I just want to kind of take you through some prompts because I want you to think about it because I think it can really help our work. I'm going to be starting to write grants for some of the journalism projects here. And so for every one of those, I'm going to make sure that I've got some kind of story. And what I want to do is I want to take the origin story, that little small nugget, right? But I want to make sure that there's a dramatic arc in there so that I'm kind of infusing it with the power of the science of storytelling. So if I have the origin story, which I know they're all good because everybody understands and relates to origin stories because we all have them, right? We've all been by a campfire and told how did you do this? Or when did you get there? Your best friend, tell me about you, right? Those are origin stories, right? But everything we do in life has an origin. So we have lots of them to play with, right? But then if you take in the dramatic arc, then you've actually got it kind of empowered, right? To get people to change, right? To care about your issue, to advocate for something, to give you money, right? Those are all really powerful, important things we all do. So if you'll take a moment, I want to kind of excavate your story, if you mind. So kind of like an archaeological dig, I like the idea of starting at the surface in present day. So imagine there's a class that you've always wanted to teach and you finally got to teach it, right? Or maybe there's a research project that you're doing now, a passion project, it could be volunteer. And think back to where it got its start. What was the aha moment or the spark that started you on the path? What motivated you to continue, right? Because it's not just the start, but our stories, in order to have the dramatic arc, there's something else. There's the hurdles that you faced. Maybe they're small. It doesn't have to be this huge, big, dramatic thing. It can just be a little thing, right? I tried and I missed the deadline for the funding and then I had to try again. And it wasn't until, it could be I'm juggling all these things, right? Telling stories doesn't have to be about all the big dramatic moments in your life. The small moments are actually what tell us more about a person, right? It's those little small vulnerabilities, our tiny stories, the ones that we're often not willing to share because we hold them so close to us. And those are the real treasures, right? But if you can find a way to start to share those, I think you tap into a real power. And so then how did you overcome them, right? So it's that dramatic arc. And you can kind of think of it, doesn't have to be perfect, Freytag's dramatic arc, but if you have enough of it, right, you're getting into the cortisol and you're getting in to the oxytocin. So if you'll take a moment, I'd just like to think for a few minutes, maybe 2 minutes. I don't know, we don't have a lot of time, but maybe think for a minute. People have something maybe in mind by now? More or less? Okay, so then I want you to think and go back a little deeper. Go back further in your life, right? How did you end up where you are now? How did you end up at East Tennessee State? Right? How did you end up doing something, right? What made you an academic? I became an academic because I was doing the JWJI stories. So I got my MFA and I thought, oh, I'm going to be a screenwriter. I'm going to be in Hollywood. I was living in LA and I was like, I'm just going to like sell my screenplays and I'll be good to go. I'm still working on it. But when I started to do those stories, I listened to them and I started to realize like I have a lot in common with academics. I do projects, I write memoir, I write screenplays, I write journalism, right? I do work in the community. And so I started thinking maybe that's a place for me. And eventually it was, right? And so that's how I ended up here. So what made you an academic? What led you to higher ed or graduate school or your PhD? What was your dissertation or monograph or book? What was the impetus or backstory for it? And then I want you to think a little bit deeper. And so if you go back at some point, maybe in the next week or over spring break or 6 months from now, and you think about this by chance, think about trying to do that for yourself. Think about the layers, like an archaeological dig. I like thinking of it like that because it's visual, right? And sometimes when I've done this before, I'll actually have people like write out visual things. I did a similar lecture to public health officials in Virginia. It was like the managers of public health. They'd come up for a conference in Southwest Virginia. And one of the women had never had anybody ask her how she got into what she did. She just never hadn't even thought about it. And so I was like, does anybody want to share? And she said, oh, well, I work on heart health. And she said, so my dad had a heart attack and we thought he was going to die. And I was young and I went to the hospital fairly young, and he made it, right? And then they started saying about all the things he could have done or he could do in the future. And she's like, right there in that moment, I decided that if I could have saved my dad and I can save other people, I want to do it. And so she completely changed her career and became an advocate for heart health. And I was like, you need to tell that story. I was like, I would call up the newspaper today and I would tell that story because they're part of their issue was how can we pass COVID and with all the things we're wrestling, how can we get people to trust us? Because public health felt like they didn't have trust. And I was like, it's your personal stories and why you do the work you do and how passionate you are. It's a civil service. It's hard. It's day in, day out. Sometimes the things you're going and going to restaurants and seeing if they're clean or not, right? If they pass the A grade or and so sometimes it's thankless work. But if they know that you're there for a reason and you care about it and you have a personal reason you're doing it, then that makes a wonderful story. So I want you to think about going deeper. So why do you study or teach what you do? Did you discover it as an undergrad? And then I think this is kind of one of my favorite is what's the earliest moment that you had of having a passion related to it? So you think back, it could be a kid, it could be some just little moment, sort of like the watching Escape to Witch Mountain. And then what I find a lot of the scholars end up eventually telling me is a personal story. There was a young man who his whole dissertation was about the roles of Black women in community. And basically he'd been raised by his grandma, his mom, and his sister. And he just adored them. He just loved them. And he's like, I would not be where I am today. I would not be the man I am. And no one takes time to think about them and what they do and the sacrifices they make. So that was going to be his whole thing. And it was just amazing to hear him talk and tell me these specific stories about each of them, right? It was personal, right? It could be a family experience, right? There was a guy in Detroit and he was sort of examining the intersection of African-American and indigenous culture in Detroit. And I was like, huh? I was literally like, what? So I'm like, and he was telling me, he was great. He was a wonderful spokesperson. He was telling me all his cool stuff he was doing. And I just finally stopped him and I was like, how on earth did you get to this? And he was like, oh, well, if you look at the city, you'll see there was a really strong indigenous community, blah, blah, blah. But then the African-American community came over and took this area, created a community there. He goes, but my aunt was really big in the indigenous community and had done work as a community activist. And I didn't find out about it until I started looking around these issues. And then I realized my aunt is at the center of it. And so then I went to go interview my aunt. And that opened this whole world. And I was like, oh, wow, right? So it's like you don't know what you're going to find out until you keep asking the questions. So a lot of times I tell my students, when you get to the very end of your interview and you've worn them out, like you ask and ask, I always, at the very end, I always ask one more big open-ended question to say, well, what are the big takeaways that maybe I didn't get? Or like, could you maybe tell me that in a different way? And almost every time, that is the thing that is the best quote that I'm going, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. I just won the lotto. Like, it's always amazing. And I think some of it, and I don't know, and I'm kind of wanting to figure this out. I want to kind of study, I don't know how to study it exactly, but I feel like they relax, they start to get comfortable in the material and what they're talking about. And then somehow their brain just kind of brings it all together, right? They've had time to process it. But I swear, every time I feel like I get the best quote, or it's the one thing, like maybe I hadn't gotten anybody and figured out what it was that was going to be the thing that opened up the story. And then boom, there it is. So, so keep going until you find something tangible, something real, something that evokes feeling, something that rekindles the spirit in you, right? That woman that shared in the public health meeting, like you could just see the light go on in her face. She was so excited because she was like, oh my gosh, like this is my story. This is why I do this. And it was almost like she had forgotten her own life, right? It was really special. And I really loved it. And I think that can happen for all of you too. So we'll kind of end. So this is kind of where this all comes together for the research that I'm going to do. So that's me there with NLGJA. NLGJA is the National Lesbian, Gay, and Journalist Association. I have been a member for 20 plus years. I've been a chapter president in Arizona. I was a member on the board in Los Angeles. I've been a national board member twice. I've been co-chair of their conventions. We do conventions every year. And so NLGJA, if you're not aware of it, there's a lot of what they call affinity organizations in journalism. So they have the National Hispanic Journalists Association, NABJ, the National Black, the, Native American, Asian American are the main ones. And so those affinity organizations would help, they're like a networking group that helps people get jobs, network, does education. And so NLGJA was started in 1991 around the AIDS crisis. And the person who started it, Roy Aarons, and the individuals that founded it wanted to do two things. They wanted to help change the trajectory of news coverage and awareness of the AIDS epidemic. And the second thing was they wanted to get partner benefits for people. And then when they ended up finishing doing those things, they wondered if they actually had a reason to have an organization, but of course they did. And so they went on and they do conventions every year, which is like they have like a whole student project where young journalists come and do stories at the convention. There are workshops on everything in emerging journalism. There's a whole networking and job career fair there. But then also throughout the year, we have state chapters and student chapters around the country. We create a style book, which is basically like your AP style book, but for LGBTQ trans terminology. So like what should you be using in your news stories or in your public relations materials? And then we also produce it in Spanish. And then we also have like a rapid response team. So when things happen, like there have been a couple things recently and we needed to speak out about maybe AP press being banned from the White House, then we go and we kind of take on issues, right? A lot of the work is going to big newsrooms and talking to the people that are in charge and trying to help them understand why we need to improve coverage, why it's important to have minorities and voices of all different kinds of people. And so when I got this job, they're like, you're going to have to do some research. And I was like, I'm just an MFA. And so I'm doing screenplays and things like that for my creative. But I started to think about like, what is something that I'm really passionate about and what needs to be like some stories that need to be told. And one of the things I think is that right now we're living in a time kind of misinformation, disinformation, right? Where because of social media, because of the ways that people exchange news, we don't always know what to trust. But I also think that when I think about all of these things and origin stories, journalists don't tell their stories. We're told not to be part of the story. Like that's what I grew up with, right? That's what I lived. But I kind of think it might be wrong. I think that what we've done is a disservice to ourselves and to the community, because I think people don't understand who we are. They don't understand our methods. They don't understand what we're trying to accomplish. And I think that lack of transparency has really dissolved journalism now. And so I keep thinking about doing sort of a brand campaign of like local journalists so people can get their stories out. But the way that I'm going to start to do this is through NLGJA. So no one's really told the story of the organization and its impact and how it's changed lives. It changed mine. My job at Us Weekly came from an email from somebody in the organization. They said, hey, I need somebody to cover Britney Spears with her conservatorship. You want to do it? And I was like, okay, sure. And they're like, you're hired. And then that led to somebody creating a job for me at E! News. And so many of the things, my job at JWJI, another person that I knew who worked at Emory as a communications director said, hey, they need somebody to help with their profiles. And I was like, okay. So much of my career is based on just the networking that I did, the friendships, the relationships that I have. And so what I'm hoping to do is sort of take some of that science of storytelling and take origin stories and then go in and start to tell those. And one of the things that's kind of unique about NLGJA is that while like other of the affinity organizations are wonderful, we sort of are an umbrella organization in that we have all the LGBTQ folks. We also have African American, Native American, Asian American, white folks like me, right? So there is a very deep diversity of people and diversity of like newsrooms, everything from small newsrooms to the New York Times, to entertainment, to public relations. And so I'm really excited about starting to dig in. I've met one of the founders and we had a meeting last week. And so I'm just starting, the goal is basically to create a documentary for NLGJA that they can use to promote themselves and tell their history, a short one that they'll have at conference. Then we're going to hopefully do a book, and the book may just be all about NLGJA. It may end up being that I reach out to other affinity groups, and maybe we do a book where each affinity group tells their story and their impact, and then eventually I perhaps want to do something like a long-form documentary for them. So that's kind of my work and where I'm headed next. So if you have any questions, I know we're at time, so...